Hello and welcome to our second online video lecture. This week we're going to be looking at the Enlightenment. So last week we talked about the age of absolutism and absolute monarchs. Now remember that we mentioned how these absolute monarchs were the exact kind of thing that the people of Europe had been calling for, the type of leader they'd been calling for, due to how weak governments were during the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. Now, when they get that, they finally get the kind of leader they've been asking for, they realize maybe this is too much power. Now, we saw some positive things happen from absolute monarchs, like the advancement that happened under Peter the Great in Russia. But even that, somebody who forces so much radical change, I mean, he's affecting the way people dress, the things they eat, the kind of music they're allowed to listen to. That's always going to ruffle some feathers. So even Peter at the time, a lot of the people of Russia, the nobility especially, kind of resented him. So had a negative feeling about these absolute monarchs who had complete control, and therefore people had no say in government. So you start to see a movement of philosophers who argue that people should have more of a say, basically fighting for the ideals of democracy. And this is known as the Enlightenment. Now, this is incredibly important for us here in the United States because these Enlightenment thinkers directly influenced our government, and the American Revolution was inspired by these ideals. So this week, in your assignments outside of today, you've been looking at revolutions, right? You've been looking, on Monday you watched some videos on the American Revolution, French Revolution, and Haitian Revolution. Now you should have been working on an assignment the last couple days for the French Revolution, and tomorrow you have another reading over the Haitian Revolution with questions. So all three of those revolutions, in the order they happen, American Revolution's first, and pretty easy to argue that it's the most successful as far as achieving Enlightenment goals. Then you have the French Revolution, and then the Haitian Revolution. Right, all of them Enlightenment. So that's where we're looking at today. This is actually, you would kind of typically learn about the Enlightenment first and then look at the revolutions, but we've adapted a little bit due to digital learning. So if you look here, it says definition of enlightenment. What is the Enlightenment? Well, it's an intellectual movement that stressed reason, thought, and power of the individual. Okay, so reason and thought, right? Reason and logic, these become kind of a focus if you look from the Renaissance on. I mean, in the scientific revolution, in the Renaissance itself, the fact that people can be reasonable and logical, and the human mind's ability to use reason and logic to draw conclusions should be relied on, where before the Renaissance that really wasn't happening because it was all just based on scripture and religion. Thought, reason and thought, the human's mind ability to do both of those, and then the power of the individual, putting power in the hand of individual people, and do the right thing given the opportunity. So we look first at two really influential, important thinkers from the time period. We have Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Locke you may have heard of already in your American government classes if you took that. Now, these kind of set the stage. Their ideals of what a social contract should be and what the best form of government is and why kind of set the stage for the Enlightenment, Locke in particular, because he's the one that's more in favor of the Enlightenment ideals. Hobbes is the more traditional conservative viewpoint that supports absolute monarchy. All right, but beyond the government, there's a huge argument they have on human nature that's still debated a lot today. There's no clear answer of person was right, this one was wrong. Like, Locke is right, Hobbes is wrong, or vice versa. It doesn't really exist. People still tend to agree with one or the other. So that's a big part of today as well. And you can see their ideas here. Right, it says Hobbes' social contract. Because people always act in their own self-interest, they need a strong government or social contract that can keep order and demand obedience. He argues that people are inherently selfish. So again, this is Hobbes. This is his ideal on what human nature is and what people act like. Left to their own devices, right? If there's no influence, if people aren't taught to do something, taught to act a certain way, this is how they would act, right? He says people always act in their own self-interest, so they only care about themselves and maybe those closest to them, their close family members, their closest friends, a small circle of people that they actually care about. Don't really care about people they barely know or don't know at all. He says because of that, because people are selfish, they need a strong government that can keep order and demand obedience. Basically saying without government and strict laws, there would be anarchy and chaos. People would steal from each other, harm others just to look out for themselves. If somebody had something they wanted, they might kill them and take it, right? Because people are driven by that selfishness. That would be Hobbes's belief and argument. Now, that's inherently selfish, okay? And whether or not you agree that absolute monarchy is a good answer, you could still think that he's right about human nature and not agree about absolute monarchy. That's possible, all right? So again, people are selfish. They only look out for themselves and those closest to them. He says, without government, there would be a war of every man against every man, and life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay? So if there was no government and laws, it would be anarchy and chaos, right? And people would be selfish and looking out for their own, and that's it. All right, so he argues that absolute monarchy is the best, and that he wrote a book called The Leviathan, which is about his beliefs, right? And it's kind of, the Leviathan is this mythical creature, kind of think like this water creature that causes chaos and is unpredictable. And then the social contract is just his idea of what the exchange between people and government should be, what the people are giving up and what they're getting in return. So under absolute monarchy and under his ideas, people are giving up a lot of rights and giving up all political power in exchange for a powerful government that can enforce laws and therefore enforce a safe society. They can have punishments, harsh punishments for their laws, and ensure that people do the right thing because they're forced to do the right thing. Right? People aren't stealing because it's illegal and the punishment is so severe. That would be the mindset. All right, where Locke, on the other hand, says that people are reasonable beings with the natural ability to govern themselves and look after society. People are inherently compassionate. They are reasonable, right? Human mind and its ability to reason. And they have a natural ability to govern themselves. You don't have to have a strong government that's doing it for them. And they can look after society on their own. They are inherently compassionate. So, not inherently selfish, like Hobbes said, but on the other hand, they're inherently compassionate. They care about others. People care about the well-being of all, not just themselves. It's a different mindset. And you see these kind of two arguments brought up still a lot in politics. This has not gone away. Like if you compare capitalism and socialism, which are economic policies, right? Socialism relies more on people look out for each other and want the best for each other. Capitalism is more kind of every man for himself mindset. It says the purpose of government is to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. All right, so that should sound pretty familiar, maybe to Thomas Jefferson, who just changed it slightly. Right? He didn't say life, liberty, and property, but life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he's saying, and he was that, well, it's so similar because Jefferson was inspired by Locke. But life, liberty, and property, he says that every person has born with natural rights, so that cannot be taken away from them. These are inherent, is something that you're born with, and the government should protect your natural rights to life, right? So people shouldn't be able to threaten your life and kill you. Liberty, liberties in a justice system, liberties in, protecting your beliefs and rights, those kind of things. And property, that people can own property and that once you do, it's yours and it can't be taken. Now, Jefferson changed that slightly, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he says that everybody has a right to life, agreed there. Liberty agrees there. And rather than property, a pursuit to happiness. Everybody has the right to try to be happy, to do what makes them happy, as long as it doesn't affect someone else's pursuit of happiness, life, or liberties. All right? But he was not willing to put property because he's saying, well, hey, not everybody is guaranteed to own things and have property. There's going to be rich and poor. Some people might not have any property at all. You're not naturally guaranteed to have property. So he changed from Locke's beliefs a little bit. Government property, citizens have a right to overthrow it. They should overthrow the government if it fails to protect your life, liberty, and property, because that's the purpose of government. Not to enforce strict laws and force people to do certain things, but to protect their citizens' life, liberty, and property, or for Jefferson, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. If a government's, he says a government's power comes from the consent of the people. Why is government powerful? Why does government have the ability to pass laws and enforce laws? Because people give it that power. Right? So it's the modern democracy. People vote and choose representatives to make laws because they want somebody to make laws to make a safe society. That's kind of the idea. All right, so we'll come back to that, but that's an overview. Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes supports absolute monarchy. Locke supports democracy. They have a very different viewpoint on human nature. All right, that's going to be important. So the agreement that people make with their government, what they give up, what natural rights they give up, is the social contract, right? And we do. In any society that has a government, you give up certain rights. Like if you were to, get your driver's license and go out on the road, say leaving Douglas County High School, you can't just immediately drive whatever speed you want. There's a speed limit, and that's a right that people agree to. Hey, I'm going to give up my right to drive however fast I want in exchange for hopefully a safer society where the roads are safer because people hopefully are following, the speeding laws. All right. So law and order, protection from the laws, order in society. All right. So the philosophers or philosophers that are advocating for reason, they have 5 core beliefs: reason, nature, happiness, progress, and liberty. That's what they're going to focus on. And we're going to see 5 examples of Enlightenment thinkers here and the things they were arguing for. And like I said, that's going to sound pretty familiar, hopefully, to a lot of the things that we see reflected in our own government in the US. Because the American Revolution, remember, was really the first major movement inspired by Enlightenment ideals. So first we have Voltaire, possibly, I think, one of the more famous ones here, along with John Locke. These are all pro-Enlightenment. They would agree with Locke largely on human nature, that humans are compassionate and will do the right thing, and given the ability, they will look out for not only themselves but others. So he wrote satire, which means it is poking fun of things intentionally, but they're poking fun at things that happen, right? We've talked about satire before, like mentioned that modern examples would be things like South Park that poke fun at things in society to try to kind of, point out that there are flaws in it, but they're usually a little more dramatic and over the top. So it says he made fun of monarchy, clergy, and the aristocracy of France. So he lived in France and he was making fun of the monarchy and why they had so much power, why they were the way they were. Same thing with the Catholic clergy. And in doing this, he definitely ruffled some feathers. And you see at the bottom there, he eventually is exiled for 2 years for his beliefs and for this satire that he wrote that the people in power were not big fans of. But his ideals, the ones you would want to associate with Voltaire, says that he defends freedom of speech, tolerance, and freedom of religion. So those are huge ones, right, for the U.S. in particular, and something I think sometimes we take for granted because it's what we know as U.S. citizens. Freedom of speech, that you can say things that you believe, and you can share your opinions, and you can't be punished for saying those things. Right now, you might think, hey, at a job or at school, you can get in trouble for saying things you're not supposed to say. That's different. That's not the government coming and punishing you, right? I mean, if you lose a job because you are cursing at work and you get fired, that's not an infringement on freedom of speech. That's what's appropriate for the workplace and what's not. And if you get fired, that's not the same as the government showing up at your door, the police showing up at your door and arresting you, right? It's very different. Freedom of religion, that you can practice whatever religion you want. The government can't tell you what religion you have to practice. Remember, in this time period, there were a lot of countries where the government told you what religion you could or could not practice. That was kind of common, right? So he's arguing that that should not be the case. Now, freedom of speech is the one you hear about the most with him. And there's these quotes, that Voltaire basically operated by the mindset of he might disagree completely with what someone says, but he will defend to his death their right to say it. So even if you think someone's being idiotic, you think their opinions are horrible, you disagree completely, it's the idea that that's when freedom is, they still have the right to say it. And some people get caught up with that. I think modern day social media influence, like, hey, the people I agree with, great, they should talk a lot, and the people I disagree with are annoying, and tell them not to talk or argue or wish they weren't saying those things. No, it's both sides. You're going to see things you agree with and disagree very frequently if it's complete freedom of speech. And like I said, sometimes I think in this country we take it for granted how great of a thing it is to have freedom of speech. Many countries in the world do not. Just a few years ago, there's an example in Turkey where a doctor in Turkey made a post on social media where he took the president of Turkey and he took 3 pictures of him and put them next to 3 pictures of Gollum from Lord of the Rings. If you don't know who that is, you can look it up. But he's a little creature, ugly, not someone you'd want to be compared to. And because they don't have freedom of speech there and you're not allowed to say negative things like that about the government, and the president didn't like the post, he ended up being thrown in jail for a year for a post on social media, right? I mean, if you think about all the negativity and things that people say about U.S. government or politics and both parties back and forth, I mean, if that was illegal here, it'd be very different, right? I mean, people have something to say about everything with our government all the time, and that's part of freedom of speech, is that you can complain about the government if you want to. Okay, next we have Montesquieu. He wrote on the spirit of laws, in which he talked about a need for a division of power in government. He said the best form of government would have 3 branches, just like our government has, right? And he said there should be a check to the power of government. And how is there a check to the power to make sure that the government is not too powerful? Is that each branch has a different branch that can kind of check their power and keep them in place. So in our own government, right, we have the judicial branch with the Supreme Courts, we have the legislative branch with Congress, and we have the executive branch, the president, right? And really, if you look at how these different branches work, they all have ways to stop the other branches from acting with too much power. And really, the way the system is designed, the most powerful branch is what? The legislative branch, right, with Congress. They actually have the most power and ability. The problem is to fully exercise that. Maybe not a problem, but the reason it doesn't always seem that way is because you have to get the members of Congress to agree, which is not pretty close to half and half Republican and Democrat, right? So it can kind of limit their power. But again, that's a check on their power also, all right? But the different branches can, the president can veto decisions of Congress, and it goes back to Congress, and they can vote on it again to try to override that veto, but they have to get that 2/3 support, which is not easy to do. All right, Rousseau, he said that there's an rules to create. He argued for direct democracy, which we talked about in Athens, Greece, which would be people vote on every decision, not voting for representatives, but rather you vote on every decision, and therefore you're always doing what a majority of people want. And that's good in some ways, because you always get what a majority wants, but you can have minorities ignored, and it is slow. It is a slow process to have everybody vote on every decision. If you pay attention to the news and stuff, you can see how long sometimes it takes to count votes. So not an efficient system. He is famous also because he's the person who coins this term, the social contract, right? And we have all these different people here in this time period, these philosophers arguing what their opinion, what the social contract should be, the agreement between people and government. Rousseau is the one who coins this term and says, hey, the social contract is the agreement between people and their government, and what people are willing to give up in exchange for law and order. He also argues that man is born free, right? So there should be no noble titles, and man is born free. No noble titles would be like, dukes and sirs and knights, things of the time period that put someone above someone else from birth. And then man is born free, like, not slaves, and they have natural rights. You're born with those. So those ideals that in this time period, there was still plenty of slavery around the world, right? Beccaria, he is going to argue for an improved justice system, right? And he's focused on that. So he's another Enlightenment thinker just like these other ones, and you're just seeing different ideals that are reflected in our own government. This included, he's saying that there should be a speedy trial, and there should be no cruel and unusual punishment. So these things happened a lot in that time period. That last part also, punishment should be based on the degree of the crime, which seems obvious, right? Somebody who steals, a couple $100s worth of goods should not be punished the same way as someone who commits murder, right? That seems obvious, but that was not always the case, especially then when a lot of times you just had kings, absolute monarchs deciding punishments. They could be all over the map, could depend on their mood that day. All right, so you weren't sure. But here he's saying there should be a speedy trial. And that's important because before, someone could be thrown into prison and not have a trial for 5-6 years. They just kind of never get to it, and that person sits in jail. They're not paying bail and getting out. They are sitting in jail, waiting the trial, and then maybe that trial happens 10 years later, and they decide, oh yeah, you're definitely innocent. You can go. And you just spent 10 years in jail for nothing because you were waiting for your trial. And obviously that is a huge issue. He also said there should be no cruel and unusual punishment. So that would be things that they deemed unfair. Torture as a punishment, branding someone as a punishment. Doesn't necessarily mean the death penalty. He actually did support the death penalty. But, things that were seen as cruel and unusual, cutting someone's hand off for stealing. That would be an example. Right? There's still debate today about, the death penalty and whether or not it should be used in the U.S. Certain states use it a lot more than other ones. Again, it just depends. Mary Wollstonecraft, last of the 5 here before we go back and kind of talk about, remember there is part of your assignment attached to this lesson, and we'll explain that in a second. So Mary Wollstonecraft, she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She said that a woman's education should not be secondary to a man's. It should not come second. It should be just as important. They should receive as much education as a man, which in the time period was definitely not the norm, right? Women got much less as far as education, usually just a few years before really being expected to move back into the home and learn how to cook and clean and raise a family. That was still a very common expectation. And she encouraged women to get more involved, in particular in the fields of medicine and politics. Right? And I wish we were in the class so I could get everyone's opinion on it, but I think these two choices are interesting, right? Because she was arguing that, hey, there are not enough women in medicine and there are not enough women in politics. And okay, those were two fields at the time where definitely there was an underrepresentation of women. And I would argue that still today, you can see some definite unevenness here. Now, politics, I mean, come on. For the U.S. itself, yes, there are plenty of women in Congress and things, but we still have not had a female president, right? And a pretty long history of presidents. Now, we've gotten maybe a little closer to that, but I don't know, it depends who you ask. Some people would argue that, like, when Hillary ran for president, that one of the things that worked against her was that she was female. Who knows, right? Probably for some voters. And then in medicine, right, you might say, well, there are a ton of women's in the medical field. A ton of women. There's, people think of nurses as like a female job, but that's part of it. Is I think there's still a societal norm that people like think of nurses as, right? And obviously the doctor being the higher ranking position. Now there are plenty of female doctors as well, but there's still a stigma against it. And if you look at like research numbers and funding that's provided to doctors conducting research, most of the huge projects that are conducted at places like Emory and things like that, the larger funding almost seems to always go to male doctors and not female. And why is that? Right? Is it just chance? Maybe they were the most qualified, maybe, right? But there could also still be some unbalance there, right? And the expectation is just a little different, right? So I think that it's interesting that those fields she pointed out during the Enlightenment as, hey, fields women need to be more involved in, you could still see that today. It's definitely politics, right? Definitely politics. All right, in this time period, they started using the salon, which was a room in the house, to discuss topics and politics, and that was like a room in the house that only women hung out in, and like the parlor was a room that only men hung out in, right? And like they gathered there, and the assumption was women were talking about like clothes and hair and things like that, but really there was a lot of politics being discussed, right? Now, if we go back here to this slide on Hobbes and Locke. This is the one that I want to focus on for your assignment. Now remember, this week you have the questions on the French Revolution, 2 different readings. The French Revolution begins and Napoleon forges an empire. And then tomorrow, if you haven't already done it, you have the Haitian Revolution reading, which has a lot of questions. All right, so it looks long at first, but if you look at the questions, you'll see after the question it has numbers. And that's telling you which paragraph to find the answers in. So it can be pretty quick if you use that as a way to quickly locate the answers. And some of those questions are kind of short answers, not full sentences maybe. If it's asking who or what, you can just put the answer, remember, just like in class. Now what I want you to do for Hobbes and Locke, the one other question that you are adding to your assignment comes from the lecture. And this should be longer format. This is not a sentence or two. I want you to explain your beliefs, your personal opinion. All right, now I'm going to be reading these and looking at what you have to offer is more points. A lot of the points this week are going to come from this. Also the other assignments, definitely, but this is a big part of it, even though it's only one question. All right, so I want you to give me your opinion on human nature. Do you agree with Hobbes or do you agree with Locke, and why? All right, you need to give some real-world examples of why you agree with the person you choose. All right, now not government. Nothing to do with government here, so don't tell me that you agree with Locke because you think democracy is better, or you agree with Hobbes because you think monarchy is better. You're leaving that out. All right, human nature. Are people inherently selfish or are people inherently compassionate? Now, I know you're going to say, I don't think it's either one, or you might think it's not either one. People can be selfish and people can be compassionate. Some people are more selfish, some people are more compassionate. Obviously, that's true. But I'm talking about human nature, not what people are taught to do. All right, so you have to kind of remove society's influence. You have to almost think of it like, and I know they wouldn't be able to survive, but what if we put like 5 babies, infants on an island and let them grow up on their own, no influence from society. They weren't taught anything by parents or schools, didn't see anything on TV or hear things on the radio, whatever it might be. How would they grow up? Would they grow up to start working together? Or do you think they would just compete against each other and steal and possibly kill? Do you think they would form a little village and work together, help each other and trade, or not? right? And that's what you have to realize and think about. So it could go either way. There is no right answer, right? This is a debate that's very frequent and prevalent still today. There's no right answer. I can see an argument for both sides, all right? But if there was no influence, there was no government, what is human nature, right? And if you are arguing that Hobbes is right, you have to explain how society teaches people to be more compassionate, because Hobbes isn't going to say no one's compassionate. Obviously people are. So you'd have to say, well, people are taught to do that. Or if you think Locke is right, you have to argue that society teaches people to be selfish. And you can see either one as being true, right? And there's really easy examples. I don't want you to use just these. You need to be creative and come up with your own. But obviously, like, for an example, would say if you're agreeing with Hobbes that people are selfish, you could say, well, little kids have to be taught to share, right? They don't want to share their toys when they're little. When they first go to preschool and they start encountering other kids or whatever it might be, a lot of times they fight about toys and cry and they want everything mine, 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 right? Now, on the flip side, you could argue that maybe people are compassionate and they're taught to be selfish, right? Taught to look as money is the thing that's important. How much money do you make in jobs, right? Society teaches these things, whether you're watching TV, listening to music. I mean, how much music nowadays is just like the artist talking about how much money they have and these great cars and houses and all these things they can do in their life because of the money, right? And that's obviously teaching them to be selfish. So there's an influence from society that shows that as well, right? Look out for yourself, get as much as you can. There's plenty of that. So you could agree with either person and still explain how society teaches the opposite, right? Because I don't think anyone's going to turn in a paper where they say everyone in the world is selfish and they never show compassion. Obviously, that's not true, right? Or everyone in the world is compassionate, they never show any selfish behavior. We know that's not true either. So which one do you think is natural? No influence, like those kids on an island, would they grow up to work together, help each other survive, or would they just compete, take from each other, one or two survive, and whatever it might be? That's for you to decide. All right, but I just wanted your opinion on human nature. What do you think is natural human nature, and what do you think is learned and taught? You cannot say some people are inherently selfish and some people are compassionate. You can't fall in the middle. Now, if that's truly what you believe and you're just like, I can't pick one side, I'm telling you, you have to for the assignment, right? Just like sometimes a defense lawyer has to argue for the innocence of somebody that they probably don't think is innocent because that's their job, right? Your assignment is to pick a side and argue for that side, either Hobbes or Locke. Make sure you say who you agree with and why. Explain, give an example in the world of how this is true, that people are compassionate or selfish, and then explain how people are taught to do the opposite, because you're going to acknowledge that it does happen, but you're going to argue that is a learned and taught behavior instead. All right? So if you're live in the video, do you have any questions about this or any other part of it? Obviously, feel free to ask. If not, you can email me whenever you do watch this if you have questions, but this is part of the assignment that should be turned in, all right, at the end of this week after you finish the Haitian Revolution questions, French Revolution questions, and then this question here as well, all right? Those of you that joined live, thank you. Everybody else, hopefully you get a chance to watch this later on YouTube.